Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amber Mace, and I am the Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology. And I am so pleased that you were able to join us today for this briefing on blue carbon. I am thrilled that we are able to bring together an excellent panel of experts in partnership with the California Ocean Science Trust and Assemblymember Mark Stone's office. This is a wonderful partnership, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the California Council on Science and Technology, and you'll learn a little bit about OST along the way too, because we're very similar, and so that's why I'm so happy that we're able to partner today. So we are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We were created at the request of the legislature, just like the Ocean Science Trust. We both care deeply about bringing science and technology advice to inform policymakers on a range of issues for California. And CCST as an organization is pleased to be able to tap into a network of expertise across California. We have formal partnerships with the University of California, the California State University System, the community colleges, Caltech, Stanford, our Department of Energy labs, and NASA labs. So incredible wealth of resources that California has at its disposal as we work with them to help make California's policies stronger with science. We do this in a number of ways. One is through briefings like we are bringing to you today. We also deliver peer-reviewed reports, and we have a Science and Technology Policy Fellowship where we bring PhD scientists and engineers to California for a year of government service and leadership training in the executive branch and in the legislature. So today, with our briefing, we are taking on a topic that we have covered to date with a couple other briefings I want to draw your attention to. So this is a continuation of a conversation about how California can meet its carbon neutrality goals by 2045. So we've talked about a couple other topics in previous briefings. Those are both, the recordings of both are on our website. And one of them was on the role of negative carbon emissions in meeting California state climate goals. And the other was on natural pathways for carbon sequestration in California. And so today we are focused on blue carbon. And the title of our presentation is Carbon Neutral California, Blue Carbon Sequestration Along California's Coast. And I know there's a tremendous amount of interest in this, so I'm thrilled that you could join us today for this conversation and to hear from our experts. So I'm going to very quickly turn it over to our moderator. And our moderator today is Dr. Lisamarie Windham-Myers. She is a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in the Water Mission area, and she is based in Menlo Park. She has extensive expertise on wetland ecology and participates in several local, national, and international science advisory efforts to evaluate wetland management and blue carbon sequestration potential. Dr. Windham-Myers, please take it away.
Thank you, Amber. Well, it's really nice to see coastal ecosystems being included in natural climate solutions. So I'm glad to be moderating this session. We know that anthropogenic carbon emissions are a leading cause of climate change, and that California has set an ambitious goal of being carbon neutral by 2045. There is consensus that we need to greatly reduce emissions and increase sequestration of carbon to start reaching these goals. Today, we are going to talk about blue carbon pathways, and that's a kind of it's a natural pathway as opposed to being a more technological pathway. But both of those ways are ways you can start sequestering carbon. The blue carbon pathways that we're going to focus on today are coastal habitats such as marshes, wetlands, seagrass meadows, and kelp forests. Our panelists today are experts in California's coastal ecosystems and their blue carbon potential. Each of our panelists will introduce themselves, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So please use the question and answer feature to submit your written questions with your name and affiliation, and we'll endeavor to answer as many of those as possible. So thank you for joining us. I'll start by describing myself. My name is Lisa Windham-Myers. I am at the U.S. Geological Survey based in Menlo Park. I'm in the Water Mission area. I do a lot of measurements in coastal systems, everything from gas fluxes to water fluxes to plants and soil modeling. And I have worked not just in California, but up and down the Pacific coast, on the East Coast, and in the Gulf Coast, and been part of many national and even international, such as the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change assessments. So yeah, I'm particularly interested in coastal systems, and I think California has a lot of potential. So I'll move from there to our next panelist, which is Dr. Joanna Nelson. She's the founder and principal of LandSea Science. So Dr. Nelson.
Thank you. I'm Joanna Nelson, founder of LandSea Science. So I'm an independent researcher and consultant. I'm a salt marsh ecologist looking at responses to climate disruption. I worked in coastal environments and salt marsh ecology for about 20 years, starting at Hopkins Marine Station of Stanford University and going on to research salt marsh in Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. So that's one of 29 coastal research areas around the country. I look at salt marsh as a coastal filter. So I look at it as taking up watershed derived nitrogen that people have added, and how salt marsh takes it up and protects the coastal ocean from eutrophication and the proliferation of dead zones. I also look at resilience of salt marsh to sea level rise. And I've done that with National Estuarine Research Reserves on the West Coast and the East Coast. I'm really excited to be here today. And one other piece of the puzzle that I work on is fire ecology, which I'm going to focus on salt marsh today, but California has a lot of pieces to look at holistically. And with that, I'm going to hand it on to the next person.
Great. Our next panelist is Lisa Schile-Beers, Dr. Lisa Schile-Beers, and Dr. Schile-Beers, let's hear from you.
Hello, I'm very happy to be taking part in this briefing today. I'm a wetland ecologist with 20 years experience studying coastal wetlands within the United States and internationally. I got my PhD at UC Berkeley, specifically studying the effects of sea level rise on the wetlands within San Francisco Bay, and subsequently had a postdoc for 4 years at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Station, where I was looking at carbon stocks in wetlands, mangroves, and seagrass beds from Panama to Alaska, and also in the United Arab Emirates. So I look specifically at carbon storage within the soil and within the plants, and also methane emissions from these systems. More recently, with my work at Silvestrum Climate Associates, I've been working on incorporating coastal wetlands into the United States National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and have been involved in that for the past 4 years, and also have been working with agencies both in California, Oregon, and internationally, and incorporating coastal wetlands into their greenhouse gas inventories. And I'm part of a NASA grant looking at methane emissions in the United States and trying to be able to scale up these emissions nationally. And I've also been working on carbon project development, both within the United States and within Pakistan.
Thank you, Dr. Schile-Beers. And the last panelist that I'm going to introduce is Dr. Melissa Ward. She is at San Diego State University now. Dr. Ward.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Melissa. I am currently a postdoc at San Diego State. I recently completed my PhD at UC Davis. My work focused on California blue carbon habitats, in particular seagrass meadows, although I also did some salt marsh work and a little bit of kelp work. And I studied multiple avenues of carbon cycling, which I'm continuing to work on now. So the burial component of carbon, which we'll be talking about today, as well as the ability for the eelgrass meadows, California's primary seagrass species, and salt marshes to absorb atmospheric CO2 directly, and then the ability for eelgrass meadows to remove CO2 from seawater as a means to possibly ameliorate the impacts of ocean acidification, and then the implications for that for example, with shellfish growers. And then some of my work has also been a policy and management focus, working to contextualize those carbon values within the current management landscape of California. So in particular with eelgrass meadows, where the state is currently at on eelgrass management and how we can improve broadly and how that can impact our carbon drawdown solution. So that is my expertise, and I will turn it back to the moderator.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really thrilled to have this panel of experts because it's a really broad swath of expertise and interest across management scenarios. So I think we can just begin with some questions to start. The first one that we will begin with is a question from Assemblymember Mark Stone, who's a member of the California Ocean Protection Council. And the Assemblymember asks, how does protecting blue carbon habitats help us meet the state's climate change goals? I think let's start with you, Dr. Ward. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, sure. So we know that blue carbon habitats in general and in California store a tremendous amount of carbon in their sediment. And so by protecting the existing habitats that we do have, we're essentially preventing the emissions of the carbon stored in that sediment back into the atmosphere. So it takes a long time to accumulate that sediment, but we've accumulated carbon in those sediments for hundreds of years. And now we have this extraordinary stock of carbon that we're sitting on. And so by conserving those habitats, we're really maintaining stocks of carbon that we have now. The restoration of blue carbon habitats can also help, but I would sort of kick off the conversation arguing to also prioritize the conservation of those habitats. And I think I'll let the other panelists add more to that.
That would be great. Dr. Nelson, could we hear some of your thoughts on that?
Great. I'd like to keep going from Dr. Ward's emphasis on conservation and say that, for example, salt marsh habitats in California, we've lost up to 90% of historic marsh extent. And so that remaining marsh and the way that it functions and the ecosystem services that it provides are really important. So in these flooded habitats, carbon is stored well. And for example, in salt marshes, carbon is stored in plant branches and stems above ground. It's stored in roots below ground, and it's stored in these sediments. And as the sediments are laid down year after year, for example, they're continuing to store that carbon, and that sediment storage can be at the scale of thousands of years. So this is a definite way forward to meet the carbon neutral goals that California has.
Great. Dr. Schile-Beers, did you want to add anything more?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So following up on what the other doctors have said, we have about 62,000 hectares of tidal wetlands within California. And so that's about equivalent to about 35,000 football fields worth of wetlands. And just in this carbon storage and soils alone annually, that's about 335,000 tons of CO2 that's stored annually. And so that's about the equivalent of 73,000 cars, like what they would emit in a year. So it's a huge potential for storage within the soils. And one thing to note is that once a wetland has been diked and drained, all of the thousands of years of carbon that's been stored in the soils can be emitted in just a matter of decades. So it's really important to keep the wetlands that we do have tidally flooded, and also to restore the wetlands that have either been impounded or have been degraded or destroyed, so that we can get vegetation cover back in there and start the soil carbon sequestration again. It happens at a very slow rate, so we have to think about this in terms of more than just a decade. It takes a long time, but still it's extremely important to restore our tidal wetlands throughout California.
I think that's a good point, Lisa, about the Dr. Schile-Beers, about the degradation, and I've heard it likened to there's thousands of small fires going on by having degraded lands, and so it's just we just don't see it, but the degraded marshes are losing carbon, and so maintaining them will let that sequestration feature that you just described continue going on. I want to apologize. Apparently my video is not working well, so if that's the case, I'm very sorry, but I think we can keep going on with the rest of the briefing. So let me ask another question. I'll keep you on here, Dr. Schile-Beers. Let's talk about co-benefits of protecting or restoring blue carbon habitats. What are some of those, particularly for coastal communities, local economies, or equity?
Sure, that's a great question. So one of the biggest ecosystem services that coastal wetlands have is that they're nurseries for a lot of fish and invertebrates and birds. Many of them are commercially viable species. And so they're kind of like the nursery for a lot of different species. And also, it's very well documented that coastal wetlands act as buffers for storm surges and other extreme weather events. So wherever there is a wetland, it provides some sort of buffer from whatever that wave action that's coming in. So they do a very good job of protecting coastal communities, particularly with these extreme events of storms.
That's a really good point. So nurseries and buffers is clearly important co-benefits. Dr. Ward, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I will echo Dr. Schile-Beers' point about acting as nursery habitat and just name a few of the species, particularly within eelgrass meadows, which is where I've focused. We have nursery habitat for Dungeness crab, Pacific herring use eelgrass meadows, spiny lobster in Southern California, juvenile Chinook salmon, a variety of clams and other bivalves. So all of those species use eelgrass meadows. So they're a tremendous importance, carbon storage aside. And then the other piece that I will mention is that there's a lot of work going on in California to understand the ability for seagrass or eelgrass to remove CO2 from seawater to provide some sort of localized buffer for ocean acidification, which is a promising avenue of research right now. And that could have huge impacts along the coastline, both for ecologically important species and potentially for economically important species such as oysters. And we could do a whole nother Zoom webinar on eelgrass, oyster, shellfish interaction. So I'll hold off on that, but there's a lot of potential co-benefits between eelgrass and shellfish, and learning how we can maximize those co-benefits and minimize the negative impacts that they might have on one another it's a huge opportunity for California in the shellfish aquaculture scene. So, and then Dr. Nelson, I guess I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, great.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll continue. So as Dr. Ward brought up, the benefits of eelgrass in ocean acidification, when salt marsh, what I didn't mention about salt marsh as a coastal filter taking up nitrogen is that impacts its ability to store carbon. So I'll just make that link. So biodiverse native habitats are, by definition, providing biodiversity, providing multiple co-benefits. When I look at salt marsh as a filter for nitrogen, there are many scenarios in which added nitrogen, for example, from fertilizers, reduces the ability of the marsh to store carbon. And then I wanted to catch another part of your question about coastal communities and equity, in terms of there's a really important culture around being a coastal community and identities and what people want to fish or how they spend their time at the coast. And one example is I've worked with an indigenous land trust in the Monterey Bay area, the Amamutsun Land Trust, and being able to steward coastal habitats is really important for their identity and responsibility to continue being stewards. And that's going forward at Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve in native oyster exploration and research and in salt marsh restoration. So again, just many types of communities have cultural connection to this is how we want to be at the coast, and we're used to seeing these habitats and being in these habitats and fishing for fun or for commercial activity and being together in those ways.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so many coastal activities and communities that, carbon sequestration is just one benefit of protecting and preventing degradation of coastal lands. Thank you for that. Let's move forward with another question. This one is coming from Kirk Sato. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. When you refer to carbon storage in sediments, does this include, for example, super pollutants and other greenhouse gases that are even more potent than carbon dioxide? So for example, could you discuss the storage potential of methane, for example, in blue carbon habitats? I'm thinking Dr. Schile-Beers might have some thoughts on this.
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. So it is true that methane is naturally produced within coastal wetlands, and methane production begins to occur at about salinities about half that of seawater, so at about 18 parts per thousand. And so this can be an issue, say, like initially at a restoration site where you're still waiting for the soil carbon to accumulate and also for the vegetation to come in as well. But in the grand scheme of a coastal wetland, the carbon that's stored within the soils outweighs any sort of methane emissions that occur within these systems. So it's important if you are restoring a site to look at it in the long term, because eventually the carbon stored will be greater than that's emitted. And also it's important, like I mentioned earlier, with impounded wetlands. So in a lot of places, say in San Francisco Bay, in Sassoon Bay, it's normally a brackish site. So there's some salinity that is coming into the system. And a lot of those sites are, they're diked, and the water is fresher than it should be. So if you were to restore tidal flow to those systems, it would reduce the amount of methane that's being emitted currently. And so that's definitely a good thing to think about in the grand scheme of the carbon cycle within coastal wetlands.
I do think that's important too. Dr. Ward, did you want to chime in on other or actually I should say, before I go to Dr. Ward, I'm thinking about the nitrogen and the comment made by Dr. Nelson. Did you want to chime in about greenhouse gas emissions that differ other than CO2?
Yeah, just briefly, there's work starting, so measuring denitrification. So nitrous oxide is one greenhouse gas, and that's forms of nitrogen like nitrate that are in the soil can be returned through microbial activity to inert forms of nitrogen in our atmosphere, and that's called denitrification. And so that's, having the inert form in our atmosphere is great and not a greenhouse gas. There's an intermediate product, nitrous oxide, that is. And because measuring that gas flux in the field is really hard, there's more and more work coming out. So doctors Elizabeth Watson and Kirstine Wasson at Elkhorn Slough are doing some of that work. There's work out of Maryland, right, to give us, across the country, but to give us some sort of scope. So that work goes forward and is really helpful to understand what's happening in flux out of marshes.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of research going on actively that you're all bringing up, and I've gotten a question here from William Abrams about research, and he's wondering, how can this research be applied to meet the governor's 30 by 30 executive order, which is to conserve 30% of California's lands and waters by 2030? I wondered, let's stick with you, Dr. Nelson. Do you have a thought on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really exciting development, and the ability to decide which 30% of lands and waters will come into this decision. So So I really enjoy all the advocates for their habitats and ecosystems of like, look at perennial grasslands and what they can do with their roots. And also salt marsh gets held up as on a per area basis that it could store as much as 10 times more than terrestrial systems like forests. There is less marsh habitat, right? So we have less of that area, but on a per area basis, it's really important. And it's in the executive order for California's efforts on carbon neutrality that all of the work to achieve carbon neutrality, so this is from point number 6, shall be implemented in a manner that supports climate adaptation and biodiversity, including protection of the state's water supply, water quality, and native plants and animals. So these are in executive orders already put together, that this is how we get to carbon neutrality, is focusing on biodiversity and habitat protection and ways that we also use and steward habitats.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, the specific point about climate adaptation. Dr. Ward, did you want to chime in on the 30 by 30 initiative and the preservation of California's lands and waters?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's been succinctly summarized here by Dr. Nelson and others, but we essentially have a tremendous opportunity here. We know that blue carbon coastal habitats can store more than terrestrial habitats on a per area basis. We also know that we've lost a lot of those habitats across the state, and now we're being charged with protection, increased protection of those habitats. And so it's a pretty clear avenue in my mind to get a handle on what we have remaining in an effort to preserve those carbon stocks, and in addition, all the carbon benefits that the ecosystem benefits that we measured, that we mentioned before. So yeah, I would say just getting a handle on preserving what we do have left is a pretty clear avenue in my mind to ensure that we maintain the carbon stocks that we do have.
Great. The conservation theme is coming through loud and clear from you guys. I've got a question here from Vanessa Suarez, which is, are there other ways blue carbon ecosystems can specifically benefit environmental justice communities and some of the burdens they experience? Dr. Ward, let's stick with you. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that Dr. Nelson will have some good points to add to this too, but in general, we know that the climate crisis is going to be impacting disproportionately underserved communities across the globe. And so it's really on a broader level, we're obligated to try to meet climate goals. On a more local level, we know that these ecosystems are important to many communities across California, many of those such as fishing communities, coastal communities, and given the ecosystem services that they do provide, aside from carbon drawdown potential or carbon storage, it's inextricably linked to social justice issues. The climate crisis and social justice. So I would just sort of call for everybody to be putting their best foot forward on this as a way to ensure that we can reach, our targets on that standpoint.
Yeah. Dr. Nelson, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, this gives me, thank you, Dr. Ward, a great foundation for just adding that, again, having these habitats intact, functioning, restored, for example, is really important, and then having access to those habitats. So being able to be at the ocean and see or experience or dive in kelp beds, the ability to be in marsh. And I'll take one pretty specific example, that in Sassoon Marsh in San Francisco Bay, which Dr. Schile-Beers has mentioned, there's marsh protection, an existing marsh, and there are oil refineries. And those are, so having, and there are communities that are speaking up about their exposures And so having the ability to be exposed to natural habitats that are taking up CO2, exposure in a beneficial way in this case, and the ability to be involved and be part of stewarding those habitats, it has a justice component. I'll hand it on to Dr. Schile-Beers if you have anything else.
Sure. So one thing that Dr. Nelson mentioned is kelp forests. And I've been working on a project in British Columbia that's funded through the First Nations. And it's looking at how seaweed production or seaweed farming could be used as a way of both taking carbon out of the oceans that are already taking up way too much carbon dioxide compared to what it historically should be. So finding ways of taking the carbon out of the ocean into these seaweed farms, and then the practical use of the seaweed both in used as a fertilizer, and it's been shown that adding seaweed to cattle diet reduces their methane emissions. So it has, you go from the sea to the land, there's lots of ways of scaling up and having carbon emission reductions. So getting involvement of local communities in actually doing some small scale or even large scale seaweed production farming, that's one way of involving people in their environments close to them. But still, there's a lot of information or data that we don't have about specifically with kelp forests, but that's a growing topic, research interest. But definitely having some sort of way of using our coastal environments from an economic perspective, it's definitely something that could be promoted more.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's so many benefits and economic benefits on the coast, as well as just the carbon stored in the soils. We do have a question. I'm going to just plug through. We have so many questions coming through. Here's one from the Nature Conservancy. This is from Sydney Chamberlain. It has to do with the permanence of carbon stored by these mechanisms. So he's wondering if you could comment on the permanence of carbon stored and how this compares with other nature-based mechanisms of storing carbon. So for example, in forests or grasslands, like Dr. Nelson had brought up earlier. And do you see permanence as a limitation for the use of blue carbon as a climate solution? I think this really gets to marsh resilience and the potential to hold on to our coastal lands. Thinking about coastal squeeze is probably what he's thinking as well. But I'll turn it over to Dr. Schile-Beers.
Sure, that's a great question. I would think compared to terrestrial systems that coastal wetlands do have the ability to store carbon for a longer basis or a longer period of time than other ecosystems. I'm thinking, for example, in some aspect, like in Belize, for example, you can have 14 meters of carbon that's been stored, and it's been there for 7,000 years. That it's a very long period of time that this carbon is staying within the systems. And also you can see in Ireland that there's bog people that are found in peat, and it's just like the preservation capabilities of inundated soils. So I do think that there is a greater level of permanence of carbon within these systems.
Yeah, I agree. Dr. Nelson, did you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. I just continue that vein and say that marsh sediments are a source, just like Dr. Schile-Beers said, of storage for thousands of years. There are some differences of looking at how kelp, whether kelp is kelp detritus is eaten by something else and just cycled in the carbon cycle, or in different analyses, there's an assumption that it falls to the deep sea, and that's storage. That's long-term, thousands of years storage. So it does depend on where we track this carbon as ending up. And marsh resilience that you brought up, Dr. Windham-Myers, it's important that we have the ability to conserve and restore habitats that are dynamic, that move in space and time. So I will always plug for nature-based storage of carbon and support of nature and biodiversity. And that's a really important thing to be tracking, is where are these habitats? Where will they be under different conditions? How is it possible to accommodate movement? Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Ward, could you speak on permanence, particularly in the subtidal environment that you've worked on for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking about your defined time scale of interest here is important. So everything is storing a little bit of carbon. So above ground biomass, the actual seagrass blades, in the case of a seagrass meadow, is storing a certain amount of carbon. But in the case of the biomass, if it sort of dies 1 year, a lot of that carbon that was stored in the biomass can be remineralized and converted back into CO2. And the same thing would happen in a forest, right? In that case, the tree is living for maybe 100 years, but if the tree dies, then it breaks down. A lot of that carbon will be returned to the atmosphere in the form of CO2. In the case of the terrestrial forest, a small portion of the carbon may get buried into the sediment in the forest. In a seagrass meadow, you have roots and carbon from external sources, maybe phytoplankton, that get entrapped in a seagrass meadow, and the sediment accumulates rather quickly. And there's also low degradation of carbon in blue carbon habitats because the sediments have low oxygen compared to, for example, a forest. So that's the mechanism by which the permanence of carbon in blue carbon habitats is high, because there's low degradation of that carbon material. So it's not to say that forests aren't valuable from a carbon perspective. It's just that the time scale of interest is a little bit different. So the value in blue carbon habitats is their permanence, because you have these carbon rich sediments that are accumulating over thousands of years and maintaining a super dense, rich carbon sediment record. So there's a definite value in blue carbon habitats in the permanence perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I think coastal carbon is often underappreciated for its permanence, because these are deep, old deposits that last for millennia, and it's a lot of carbon per unit area compared to, for example, a more mineral soil that's accumulating smaller fractions. And also those tend to saturate. At some point, the carbon density is where it is for the uplands, but for coastal, the mechanism is accretion, and accretion just keeps going. The sea level rise keeps going. So I think permanence is actually something we have on the coast that sometimes people assume is not the case because of, again, loss of wetlands due to basically human activities. So great, thank you. I'm going to switch now to a question by Amy Vieira. She's at CSU Monterey Bay, and she's asking, if I understand correctly, the Air Resources Board will consider the incorporation of blue carbon in the next AB 32 scoping plan, which is expected in 2022. The scoping plan describes the approach California will take to greenhouse gas emissions to meet the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals, and it's updated every 5 years. So if that's the case, what are the highest priority science needs that we should be focusing on? She's asking the opinions of the panelists. And I will opine later, but I think first I'm going to just ask you, Dr. Ward, what do you think are the kind of the the highest bang for the buck research projects that are needed right now?
Yeah, good question. I think I'll stick with seagrass, because it sounds like Dr. Nelson and Schile-Beers can probably address the tidal marshes. In terms of California seagrass, there's some more academic questions that I think we can focus on that need to be addressed. Things like what are the drivers of blue carbon storage, and what are the sources of carbon stored within an eelgrass meadow? So it's not always eelgrass itself that is being buried in the meadow. There is accumulation of other sources of carbon and trying to parse apart where that carbon is coming from. For example, you get some eelgrass that ends up in a salt marsh that gets buried, or vice versa. Is there terrestrial material that becomes entrapped? So on a landscape context, those are some of the academic questions, but there are also sort of a second suite of questions that is a more basic management level of question, just figuring out what's driving losses of eelgrass across the state. We've seen some tremendous losses and don't actually know what's driving all of that. And given what we know about carbon stocks, it's in our best interest to sort of figure out where we have eelgrass, where it's being lost, where it's being gained, and to contextualize the carbon stocks stored in those habitats across the state. So that can be improved by state monitoring, which I know is something that is sort of always difficult to ask for, but basic monitoring can improve that. Because eelgrass is subtidal in many cases, it can be difficult to monitor. And so just figuring out where we have eelgrass and where we're losing and gaining eelgrass and why is super important. So I'll turn it back to you, Lisamarie.
Great. Yeah, Dr. Schile-Beers, do you have some thoughts on research avenues that would be helpful in the for the next scoping for AB 32, getting coastal ecosystems in there?
Oh, definitely. I will agree with Dr. Ward that we don't really understand the lateral flow of carbon in ecosystems from, say, the terrestrial environment into coastal environments, and how much is actually getting stored from all of these different systems. So that's a definite research need. Also, as much as we know that methane has a really significant impact for emissions. It's about 25 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas, but we still don't really know much about the spatial distribution and the amount of methane that is getting emitted in these systems. And so that's just a basic need, both within natural systems. So eelgrass, there is methane that's emitted. Coastal wetlands, there's methane that's emitted. But then in these degraded and impounded systems, we don't really know the degree to which this is being, the amount of methane that is being emitted. So this is definitely something that we need more research on, for sure.
I agree with you. Dr. Nelson, any thoughts more on that?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the highest priority science needs, or again, continue and pick up where Dr. Ward said we need to know more about what's driving loss in eelgrass. And that's true in salt marsh systems too, with erosion of the banks. You have salt marsh with tidal creeks through it and just get erosion, or get subsidence and get mudflats, which are lower in the intertidal than salt marsh. And so with my work on nitrogen, one way that we have this positive feedback loop where the better it gets, the better it gets, or the worse it gets, the worse it gets, is again with nitrogen, where if too much of the nitrogen that people add to land winds up in the ocean, we get algal blooms and algal die-offs that lead to low or no oxygen zones called dead zones, because then organisms throughout the water column die. And if salt marsh can't take up all that nitrogen, then those algal blooms can shade out eelgrass, and then eelgrass dies and its carbon storage, the above ground portion at least, is lost above the sediments. So the ability to continue along an intertidal frame, healthy salt marsh and healthy eelgrass in the subtidal, and having kelp, also continue and store carbon is really important. So the science need is, how do we continue to support, maintain, restore habitats that are dynamic? So it's about rapid change, and it's about accelerated rapid change with climate disruption.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to opine on that issue of resilience. I think that modeling where to prioritize conservation and restoration it's an open-ended field right now, because the models don't tend to converge on, they can be very conservative or very liberal, and in terms of loss. So I think I would point in that direction. We do have a question about kelp coming up, which I'll go back to you when I get there. But for now, we have a question here from Amy Arzate with the Office of Assemblymember Al Murasucci. The question is, how does the lifespan of kelp differ from the lifespan of other blue carbon habitats? Do we know what percentage of kelp actually ends up in the bottom of our seafloor? It's a great question. It's one of the new blue carbon ecosystems that people are starting to try to consider. It's just a hard one to follow, to track the carbon. But look, since Dr. Nelson began a conversation on that, let's just go to Dr. Nelson right now.
So I don't have a percentage of kelp on the seafloor statistic. What I do know, again, is so in the Monterey Bay is the Monterey Submarine Canyon. So that's a deep channel, so a carved out underwater canyon that quickly gets to depth. That's one way that carbon from Monterey Bay gets stored. And again, in the conversations about this is how we should consider kelp, you know, as it's an annual plant, it's quickly detritus, you know, little bits of kelp are quickly cycled and eaten by somebody else. You can't look at that as long-term storage versus this is an expectation of how much of it goes to the deep sea. So there's one paper, Kraus, Jensen, and Duarte, that estimates globally up to 88% of kelp is socked away in the deep sea, and that therefore that's a sequestration on the order of Australia's annual emissions, right? That's really substantial. So that I don't have any answers to clear up that, like, it's a little if you think about it like this, it's a lot if you think about it like that. We do have habitats off the California coast that allow for quick access to depth to being stored there.
That's a really good point. Dr. Ward, did you want to chime in on this?
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. So I think first, the first thing to note, which has sort of been said already, is that the mechanism is a little bit different with kelp because they don't have below ground biomass. They are growing from a holdfast. So the burial of carbon from kelp is not happening where the kelp is. It's happening elsewhere. And because we believe that a lot of that burial is happening in the deep sea, it's incredibly difficult to measure. And so we don't have a lot of good data on how well this happens. That Kraus-Jensen paper that Dr. Nelson mentioned takes a good whack at estimating this, but we're still really data poor on understanding this. So that there are some promising avenues within kelp or macroalgae production and cultivation, because in that sense, if you're harvesting kelp, you know where it's going, and you can quantify the carbon reduction from kelp from that standpoint. So it's not to say that it's not valuable. It is more so to say that I would be very skeptical of saying we restored X number of acres of kelp forest, and this is what we've achieved from a carbon standpoint. I think we're not quite able to say that just yet. And the other, this goes back a little bit to the define your timescale of interest question. So if you don't know what happened, the fate of the kelp beyond your restoration, if it's remineralized rapidly, then you may still have gained some carbon for a year or 2 years or however long it persisted, but unless you know what happens, it's difficult to put a number on it. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah, and maybe have a local benefit on estuarine acidification buffering, but in the larger climate, it's hard to put together. Thank you for that, Dr. Ward. Dr. Schile-Beers, considering your project up in, I think it's in British Columbia, did you want to chime in on the long-term nature of kelp for climate mitigation?
Sure. So not to belabor too much what the other doctors have said on the same topic, but it does depend on the species of kelp that you're growing, like the rate at which it produces biomass. Also, your proximity to the deep ocean has a lot to do with it. So we were looking at the depths of the water surrounding the First Nations land, just to see if there would be a higher likelihood that any kelp production would make it into the deep sea and be preserved. I know this isn't necessarily something that we see in California, but it's been shown that fjords, just the system of that, there's more sediment burial of carbon in fjords than in other ecosystems or other coastal ecosystems. But yeah, this is definitely a hot subject, and we definitely need more data to really understand this, but it is of key importance. And I'm really intrigued to be pursuing this more in the future about how we can understand this better, how we can study it better, and constrain our estimates of how much carbon is actually being stored through kelp production.
I agree. It's got potential. It needs some work. I'm going to keep you on here, Dr. Schile-Beers, for the next question. It's from Egino Emmer, and it is, can restored and conserved tidal wetlands cope with sea level rise during the next century? So what is your thoughts on that potential?
I think that there is a pretty high potential for wetlands to be resilient with sea level rise. I don't think that we give wetland vegetation enough credit in their ability to both build sediment and hold sediment in place. So I think that with sea level rise that there may be a shift in the species that you have in a certain system, but I do think that there is a higher likelihood of resilience with sea level rise. Also, the amount of sediment that's in the system is really strongly drives wetland resilience with sea level rise. So if there are reductions in sediment coming down, say, a river because of dams or of water diversion, it could make some wetlands less resilient because they don't have the sediment supply. And then also changes in storm systems and the amount of erosion that can happen along the edge. I mean, that's kind of hard to prevent erosion from occurring when you have a lot of stronger storm events from happening. But I do think that there is strong potential for wetlands to be resilient with sea level rise.
Yeah, I think that was really well put. Any more thoughts on that? Either Dr. Ward or Dr. Nelson?
Yeah, I just had one other thought, which is appreciating that resilience of marshes, that there are different dynamics in different marshes. Some are really sediment starved, some are silting in. So coastal managers and people using the coast are dealing with different things. And that one area of both research and management is adding sediment to marsh, because marsh recruits at a certain vertical height above mean tide. So here's the ocean, right? And so the ability, marshes that don't have enough sediment in circulation, and again, that might be from hydrologic engineering, from manipulations that happened. If they don't have enough sediment in the system, there are ways to add soil or sediment to the marsh surface and keep building it. And that research is happening across the National Estuarine Research Reserve systems and in other places to look at, just really how much sediment do you add so that you have marsh both recruiting by seed and growing up through that added soil. So there are management practices to deal with rising sea level rates.
Yeah, it's a term maybe some of you are familiar with, thin layer additions. It's definitely being tested in a couple places in California, and it may be a way to give them a leg up to get up to elevation to past degradation. Thank you so much. I'm going to lump these next two questions together, which are somewhat similar. One is from Ben Landis, which is, are there potential parallels and crossovers between blue carbon and terrestrial agricultural carbon initiatives like healthy soils in terms of stakeholder awareness and education, or informing policy program design? That's good for a good question about linking those together. And the other is another one from Sydney Chamberlain, again, Nature Conservancy. Do you see similar potential pathways for carbon storage in California's inland wetlands, or are these climate benefits primarily constrained to coastal ecosystems? So I will basically leave that question open. I'm going to stick with you, Dr. Nelson, since I have you on the screen, and see if you can chime in on those linked questions.
Great, I appreciate those questions. And I think looking at both parallels and interactions between land and sea are really important. And so the Healthy Soils Program and stakeholder awareness. So having worked with farmers applying for healthy soils, I'll say there's still this, the research gaps and the like, okay, we know what to do, that's good enough. So some of the Healthy Soils Program with compost additions, say to agricultural soils, asks participants, do you want to do the compost addition? Do you want to measure denitrification? Do you want to measure gas fluxes of carbon, of greenhouse gases off your fields? And then finding the way to navigate that is challenging. So the how Dr. Ward has brought up, what's your time scale of interest, of what's your resolution of interest, how much, how finely do you want to measure? And then the ability just in general to have farmers and farm workers in conversation with ocean managers, coastal managers, and fishers is really important, because we are always sending back and forth, land-based runoff and sea level rise coming up. So that ability to talk to each other is really important. And then in terms of inland wetlands, I'm just, my expertise is in tidal wetlands that have some salinity and brackish nature. So I would hand that one on to other scientists who might know better. Thanks.
Thanks. I think I'm going to, since we're getting to the end of the hour, move to this last question, which was specifically about conservation. And feel free to chime in on this inland wetland question. I will say coastal systems accumulate soil at a different rate, and it's preserved in a little bit different mechanism than inland. So, but the last question from Haley Erb is, what are the greatest challenges to drafting and enacting policies related to coastal wetland conservation? And I think I'm going to ask Dr. Schile-Beers to give some thoughts on that, and then we'll close out with Dr. Ward and Dr. Nelson if you want. At the very end, chime in, that'd be fine too. Dr. Schile-Beers?
Sure. Well, I do feel that compared to oceanic and terrestrial systems, that coastal wetlands haven't necessarily gotten the attention of the importance of the roles that they serve, both as filtering waters, like acting like a kidney and taking nutrients out of the water and such. But it's just being able to come up with the complete portfolio of all of the benefits that a coastal wetland or blue carbon ecosystems have, both in their carbon storage and their nursery protection. You just have to combine all of those aspects together to just really show and highlight the importance of these ecosystems. I would say per acre, per hectare, their ecosystem services are substantial and oftentimes much greater than other like terrestrial ecosystems. So I think it's just combining all that we know about them, all of the different benefits that they have, and then to highlight their importance. I do think like giving examples of, say, like on the East Coast, when they have hurricanes and there isn't a wetland buffer, the impact on a community is much greater than if there was a coastal wetland. So just showing tangible evidence of the benefits that these systems have, and in addition to all of the other co-equal benefits that are in the coastal systems. I think it's just important to highlight all of that with conservation.
I agree. It's a challenge to enumerate it all and convey it, but it's just it's essential. Dr. Ward, did you want to chime in on that question about challenges to conservation?
Sure, yeah. So California's eelgrass habitats are protected habitat under the Magnuson-Stevenson Act as an essential fish habitat. So those are protected, and there's a mitigation program in place currently that requires mitigation of eelgrass. I know we're out of time, so I'll try to be brief, but that program essentially mitigates for permitted loss of eelgrass. And so there are unpermitted losses of eelgrass that can happen from industrial activity or just from unexplained loss. So I think California has some policy work to do on trying to conserve eelgrass outside of mitigation purposes, and then starting to include carbon services in that evaluation of conservation. So I'll leave it at that since it's time.
Great. Well, thank you for closing us off there, Dr. Ward and Dr. Nelson. I'm sure there'll be a little bit of time if you still want to talk through the chat, but it's the official end, and we can keep the webinar open, but I think that's it.
Yes,
I will
thank you,
close
Dr.
it. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, what a wonderful panel. And that's not a surprise as a marine ecologist. Of course, I love this topic. So big thanks to our experts and to our participants who asked wonderful, excellent questions. Thank you to the California Council on Science and Technology and the Ocean Science Trust team who made this briefing possible. And it has really been an honor to speak on behalf of our partners for this briefing. Assemblymember Stone, thank you for your leadership with the Ocean Protection Council, and Dr. Liz Whiteman, thank you for your leadership of the Ocean Science Trust. Thanks to you and your team for the work that you do. I love this partnership and I look forward to continuing it. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.